Awakening, Buddha. Most of us enter recovery with one goal in mind: to stop the suffering that got us here in the first place. Whether that was drinking, using drugs, stealing, eating, gambling, sex, codependency, technology, or other process addictions. As newcomers, most of us would be satisfied with simple damage control or reduction in harmful behavior. We want to stop hurting ourselves or others in particular ways. You're reading this because there is a spark of wisdom in you that desires to seek the end of the suffering of your addiction. You've already taken the first step on the path to your own awakening. Everyone who has made the wise intention to recover, wherever they are on their path, has accessed that pure, wise part of themselves that the wreckage of addiction can never touch. So many of us have hearts that are still in pain from the suffering we've experienced. Some have undergone trauma, which often led us to seek temporary relief in our addictive behavior, which unintentionally added more suffering to our original wounds. We tried to protect ourselves by running from the pain, putting on a mask, and pushing people away for fear of being vulnerable, all to adapt to what often feels like a hostile world. We start to recover when we let ourselves believe in and rediscover our pure, radiant, and courageous heart, where we find our potential for awakening resides. Who were we before the world got to us? Who are we beyond the obsession of our conditioned minds? Who are we beneath all our walls and heartbreak? Despite the trauma, addiction, fear, and shame, there is a still and centered part of us that remains whole. There is a part of us that's not traumatized, that's not addicted, that's not ruled by fear or shame. This is where wisdom comes from, and it's the foundation of our recovery. If you're at the beginning of your recovery journey, it may seem impossible to access this part of you, but you're here because you already have. Perhaps you felt some small glimmer of hope, maybe born out of desperation, that there might be a way out, that things could change if you took wise action and reached out for help. Maybe it feels impossible to have faith in this part of you, to believe that you have the potential to be capable of wisdom and kindness and ethical deeds, to believe you can be the source of your own healing and awakening. Recovery is a gradual process. This path is a lifetime of individual steps. It's not only the Buddha's example that shows us the way, but also those before us who have gone through the process of recovery and made it to the other side. They show us that we can too. So what does the Buddha have to do with recovery? There are two ways in which we use the word Buddha, which means awakened. First, it is the title given to Siddhartha Gautama, a prince who lived in modern-day Nepal and India roughly 2,500 years ago. After many years of scholarly study, meditation, and ethical practice, he was awakened to the nature of human suffering and discovered a path that leads to the end of suffering and the freedom that comes from awakening. After his awakening, Siddhartha came to be known as the Buddha. The second use of the word Buddha follows from the first. Buddha can refer not only to the historical figure, but also to the idea of awakening, the fact that each of us has within ourselves the potential to awaken to the same understanding as the original Buddha. When we take refuge in the Buddha, we take refuge not in Siddhartha as a person, but in the fact that he was able to find freedom from his suffering, and so can we. The story of the original Buddha. To understand the nature of this awakening, it could help to know something about the life of Siddhartha Gautama. One of the many versions of the story of the Buddha tells us that Siddhartha was a wealthy prince, born into privilege, and sheltered from much of the suffering of the world. The story goes that young Siddhartha sneaked away from his palace and saw people suffering from old age, sickness, and death. He realized that no amount of privilege could protect him from this suffering. Wealth wouldn't prevent it. Comfort wouldn't prevent it. Pleasure wouldn't prevent it. Despite having a life of ease, Siddhartha still found that he experienced suffering and dissatisfaction. He was born with everything, but it wasn't enough. This persistent dissatisfaction with life, whether dramatic or subtle, is called dukkha, a Pali word we still use today. All humans experience dukkha, but some of us, particularly those of us who have struggled with addiction, seemed to experience it on a more intense level and with worse consequences. What is addiction but the consistent and nagging feeling of not enough? What is addiction other than being constantly unsatisfied? Siddhartha saw that pain was an unavoidable part of life, and he became determined to find a way to put an end to it. He left his family and for a time lived the life of an ascetic, the extreme opposite to his previous life of comfort and wealth. As an ascetic, he sat in extremely uncomfortable postures, meditating for long periods of time. He slept very little. He ate very little. He even tried breathing very little. He thought that, since material comfort hadn't eliminated suffering, maybe the opposite of material comfort would. At the brink of death, Siddhartha abandoned the idea of extreme asceticism and instead chose what he called the middle path. Siddhartha realized that both the extremes of pleasure and denial of pleasure had brought him nowhere nearer to liberation. Neither extreme had given relief from his suffering. So he set off on his own to meditate. Sitting beneath a Bodhi tree, he meditated deeply and discovered the path that leads to the end of suffering. He looked within himself for his own liberation, and he found it. What Siddhartha understood as he meditated under the Bodhi tree is known as the Dharma, or the truth, which explains the causes and nature of cyclical suffering. It's the basis of the teachings of Buddhism. Central to this path are the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, which will be explained in the next chapter. Siddhartha was called the Buddha, or the one who woke up, because most people go through life with a false sense of reality, like being in a trance. The Buddha spent the rest of his life developing the Dharma into a simple but sophisticated system. He shared it with anyone who would listen, dedicating himself to a life of service to free everybody from suffering. He defied the norms of his time by letting women and the poorest class of citizens become monastics. Everyone was welcome in his Sangha, his spiritual community. Central to his teachings was the idea that liberation is available to all, to the most broken and oppressed among us, to the sick, to the powerless, to those who have lost everything, to those who have nothing left to lose. All of us, even the most addicted, the most lost, can find our way to awakening because we all have the ability to access the pure, wise, and true nature within each of us. Walking in the footsteps of the Buddha. The story of the Buddha may seem far removed from our everyday reality, but his life before and after his awakening offers us a model for our own lives. All of us can relate to the inevitability of suffering. Aging, sickness, and death have touched us all. We've experienced the truth of impermanence. The highs we achieved in our addictions always wore off, but we kept chasing them anyway. We've also endured other forms of suffering, some self-inflicted, and some at the hands of others. And we've dealt with subtle forms of dukkha, the annoyances, the boredom, the loss of what we want, the inability to keep what we have, the impatience with life, the refusal to accept what is. And what have we done with these experiences of suffering? At this point, most of our stories start to look different from Siddhartha's, and this difference is what led us here. Instead of sitting with our suffering, we found ways to change it, avoid it, or replace it with something more pleasurable. For some of us, that came in the form of drinking or using drugs. Others use sex, relationships, food, self-harming, technology, work, or gambling. And some of our stories contain a version of all of the above. Whatever the behavior, it was just a temporary solution that always led to deeper suffering for ourselves and others. We've come to realize that our stories don't have to continue like this. The life of Siddhartha and the lives of the countless people we meet in recovery who have found an end to the suffering of addiction prove to us that there is another way. We can look back on our own lives and see clearly the path that brought us here. We can examine our own actions and intentions and come to understand how we shape our own future, and we can gain insight into the nature of our own suffering and follow a path that leads to less harm and less suffering. The Buddha began as a layperson with suffering just like us. This is not a path of miracle or blind faith. This is a path of practice, and the Buddha can be an ideal that inspires us. Experience has shown us that good results come when we put the necessary effort into our own recovery. This is a program of empowerment. We take responsibility for our own intentions and actions. The Sangha is here to help us along the way. We don't have to identify as Buddhists, and we don't have to meditate for hours each day. But we have found that the path outlined in the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path can lead us to liberation from both the suffering of addiction and the suffering that comes from simply being human. We trust in the potential in all of us to find freedom from this suffering.